We usually treat love as a safe, comforting emotion, a romantic platitude or a feeling that brings us inner peace. But historically, theology treated love as something much more dangerous, something that actually fractures the existing status quo. At the very core of Christian ethics is a foundational directive known as the twofold command, to love God and to love your neighbor. This creates an immediate, difficult philosophical problem. How are you supposed to actively love a deity you cannot see, touch, or interact with physically? The answer relies on the concept of agape, a sacrificial, outward-facing devotion. Because the divine is invisible, the only way to fulfill the command is by directing that love toward the visible neighbor. When love is an external obligation, it eventually collides with any society built on exploitation. It forces a choice. Either the love must be abandoned, or the structure must be dismantled to make room for the neighbor's dignity. Look at the Roman Empire in the 4th century. Slavery was universally accepted as a standard, legal economic engine. But a bishop named Gregory of Nyssa observed the slave markets and saw a glaring contradiction. He asked a devastating, love-driven philosophical question. How could you put a price tag on a human being? If a person is rationally formed in the image of God, how many coins could possibly equal the market value of that image? That specific theological seed, the absolute, non-negotiable equality of human dignity, sat simmering for centuries. By the late 18th century, it armed the abolitionist movement in the United Kingdom. Leaders like William Wilberforce and Quaker allies took this theology directly into the halls of British power, wielding it to legislate the transatlantic slave trade out of existence. By applying the ethic of love to global economics, the abolitionists proved that the systemic commodification of human beings was theologically and politically unsustainable. When this Christian abolitionist framework crossed the Atlantic into the United States in the 19th century, it hit a wall of fierce, immediate opposition. In 1835, the American Anti-Slavery Society launched a massive postal campaign, mailing over 100,000 anti-slavery tracts into the South. They weaponized information to disrupt the ideological status quo. The societal backlash was explosive. Postmasters illegally refused to deliver mail. Politicians warned of federal union destruction, and violent mobs flooded the streets. This intense friction tore through entire religious institutions. When the prominent English preacher Charles Spurgeon condemned slavery as the foulest blot, his sermons were gathered up and physically burned in America. Yet the boots-on-the-ground pressure across the country continued. Figures like Sojourner Truth and radical evangelical preachers directly confronted their own congregations, demanding they repent for the sin of slaveholding. This era of burned sermons and church schisms represents the actual function of Christian love. It creates a crisis, forcing a society to decide whether it values its stability more than its victims. The success of the abolitionists shifted the understanding of love from an internal feeling to a political mechanism for justice. It established that the end goal of love is the restoration of the victim's humanity. This logic eventually moved from the slave trade to the legal system itself. Since the early church, theologians had argued that penal institutions should assist in an offender's conversion. By the 20th century, this evolved into the modern movement of restorative justice. Our standard legal system operates on retributive justice, a linear path focused on punishment. Restorative justice replaces that with a continuous circular loop aimed at reconciliation, fixing the relationship using 5 mechanisms: relationship, respect, responsibility, repair, and reintegration. Restorative justice redefines the aim of the law. Instead of settling for punishment, it attempts to break the cycle of violence by reestablishing the connections between the individual and the community. Martin Luther King Jr. operated as a modern architect of this exact theology, applying the ethic of love directly against systemic racial hate. He argued that darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light has that capability. Returning hate for hate only multiplies the darkness, trapping society in a permanent, inescapable cycle of retaliation. Ethical love demands more than a search for inner peace. It requires a willingness to step into the hardest work a human can do, dismantling the law of retaliation.
For over 2 centuries, the academic consensus has treated David Hume's essay of Miracles as the impregnable, definitive takedown of miraculous claims. In modern philosophy, it serves as the primary epistemological wall defending a closed, deterministic universe. Hume's foundational argument rests on a simple proposition. He defines a miracle as a direct violation of natural law. Because natural laws are established by uniform human experience, that uniform experience stands as the absolute proof against any purported miraculous event. When C.S. Lewis is mentioned in the context of Hume's essay today, modern philosophers typically dismiss him. Because of his popularity as a Christian apologist, the Academy tends to treat him as an intellectual lightweight who engaged Hume only superficially. But an examination of the historical and textual record reveals a different reality. Philosopher Robert Larmer argues that this dismissal is unjustified. In his book Miracles, Lewis does not rely on theology to counter Hume. Instead, he dismantles Hume's proof strictly on formal, logical grounds. Lewis exposes a vicious logical circularity at the core of the text, alongside a mismatch between Hume's definition and how the laws of physics actually operate. He argues that the supposedly impregnable argument is structurally compromised from the inside out. Lewis developed and refined his philosophy in the intense intellectual environment of the Oxford Socratic Club. This was an arena for hard analytic debate, where Lewis regularly tested his ideas against linguistic philosophers like Elizabeth Anscombe, Gilbert Ryle, and Antony Flew. To engage Hume, Lewis utilized a specific analytical strategy. He temporarily set aside the historical debate over whether miracles actually happen. Instead, he tested the structural, load-bearing assumptions of Hume's proof to see if it could support its own weight. He executes this critique in 3 distinct phases. First, he exposes an inconsistency in Hume's approach to induction. Second, he maps a closed logical loop embedded in Hume's view of historical evidence. Third, he corrects the underlying definition of what a natural law actually is. If these 3 critiques are valid, Hume's a priori ban on miracles fails its logical tests. This suggests that the philosophical boundary between the natural and the supernatural is not as mathematically closed as Hume's supporters assume. This diagram outlines the first phase of Lewis's critique, exposing a contradiction in Hume's own writing regarding the problem of induction. In his broader philosophy, Hume is a radical skeptic. He explicitly argues that it is impossible for arguments drawn from past experience to prove that the future will resemble the past. Yet in his essay of Miracles, this skepticism vanishes. Hume suddenly leans on what he calls firm and unalterable experience to categorically rule out the possibility of a novel event occurring. Lewis points out that Hume is trying to have it both ways. It's difficult to maintain a radical skepticism regarding the predictive power of natural laws, while simultaneously claiming absolute certainty that they can never be altered. The academic literature highlights this exact observation. Larmer documents how both C.D. Broad and Lewis caught this slip. Lewis observes that without an absolute guarantee that nature always behaves identically, the fact an event has happened millions of times previously does not provide a rational basis for thinking it must happen again. Without the absolute guarantee of uniform experience, Hume cannot draw a hard line against the possibility of a novel event. This inconsistency weakens the proof before Hume even approaches the topic of historical testimony. The second critique moves from inconsistency to formal logic. Lewis identifies that Hume's argument commits the fallacy of begging the question. We can map the structure of Hume's proof here. The starting premise is a single node, the claim that uniform experience is against miracles. From this, Hume derives his next logical step. Because human experience is completely uniform, any historical reports claiming a miracle occurred must be false. Here is the logical loop. In order to know that human experience is uniform in the first place, one must already assume that all historical reports of miracles are false. The conclusion is actively feeding the premise. Lewis explicitly diagnoses this flaw in his text, writing, "We can know all the reports to be false only if we know already that miracles have never occurred. In fact, we are arguing in a circle." By wrapping his conclusion inside his premise, Hume has not proven that miracles cannot happen. He has merely assumed they do not happen as a hidden premise to justify his final result.
The final piece of Lewis's critique addresses physics. Hume's third error is characterizing a miracle as a violation of the laws of nature. This diagram demonstrates Lewis's countermodel. Laws of nature do not produce or cause events. They are merely conditional mathematical templates, representing the formula, if A, then B. The abstract laws of motion do not set the billiard balls moving across the felt. The laws only dictate what happens after a catalyst, like a cue stick, promote the initial motion. Lewis asks us to consider what happens if an agent introduces a novel event, or new mass, into that system. Nature's laws are not broken or suspended by the intrusion. Instead, the moment the new mass enters the environment, the laws instantly take over and dictate the new trajectories based on the new input. Lewis outlines this exact analogy in his writing, utilizing the rules of arithmetic and billiard balls to explain that laws state a pattern but produce no events themselves. It is a philosophy of science used to correct Hume's rigid framework. A miracle, under this definition, is not a violation of natural law. It is the introduction of a new variable that nature immediately assimilates. Therefore, the claim that miracles and natural law are fundamentally opposed is shown to be false. Modern critics often raise a specific scientific objection to Lewis's billiard table model. If an outside agent introduces new matter or energy into the universe, wouldn't that violate the first law of thermodynamics? To answer this, we look at the two distinct forms of the first law. We start with the weak form, which dictates that energy is conserved within an isolated system. This is a thoroughly tested, empirically proven scientific law. Proponents of miracles can accept this weak form. Acknowledging that energy behaves predictably in isolation does not logically rule out the possibility of an outside causal influence. The issue arises with the strong form of the principle, which claims that energy can never be created or destroyed under any circumstances. Larmor draws a critical distinction here. The strong form is not an empirically verified scientific finding. It is an a priori metaphysical commitment, the assumption that the universe is completely closed to outside influence. As the text outlines, the empirical evidence only demonstrates but energy is conserved in a causally isolated system. It is neutral regarding the existence of an agent capable of creating or destroying energy. A belief in miracles does not require rejecting the scientific data of energy conservation. It only requires rejecting the unproven philosophical assumption that the universe is a causally isolated system. Lewis's victory in this debate is defined by its precise scope. He does not attempt to use philosophy to prove that miracles do, in fact, happen. Instead, he proves that Hume's attempt to ban them a priori fails its own logical standards. Hume's argument is undermined by its own epistemological inconsistency, its circularity regarding historical evidence, and its errors regarding how natural laws actually operate. What remains is an intellectual harmony. Science excels at mapping the conditional patterns of the universe, while theology acknowledges the rational possibility of novel inputs entering that pattern. Modern philosophy's continued dismissal of C.S. Lewis in this arena represents a missed opportunity to engage with a rigorous, analytical deconstruction of Hume's work. True analytical rigor demands we test our assumptions about the boundaries of nature. When subjected to that scrutiny, Hume's case against the possibility of miracles is shown to rest not on empirical proof, but on a series of unexamined logical circularities.